The clock on the stove blinked 3 a.m. in sterile green digits. It was a liar. The real clock was the creak of the floorboard in the hallway, the whisper-soft click of the front door latch, the sigh of the old hinges. For 5 years, this had been his alarm. Naima was leaving again. For 5 years, Kieran had laid in bed, a statue carved from grief and confusion, listening to the sounds of his wife disappearing into the night. He never asked where she went. He was too afraid of the answer. He told himself it was a phase, a sickness of the spirit, something that would pass with the dawn. But dawn always came, and Naima would return, smelling of cold air and secrets, her eyes holding a distance that felt wider than the miles she'd traveled. Tonight was different. A cold knot of finality had been tightening in his gut for weeks. The silence in the house had grown teeth. Tonight he couldn't play the statue anymore. He slipped out of bed, his bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. He moved through the darkness of their small home, a ghost in his own life. Through the living room window he saw her, Naima. His Naima stood on the curb, her silhouette framed by the lonely glow of a streetlight. A sleek, dark car he'd never seen before pulled up, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn mist. The passenger door opened. She didn't hesitate. She got in, and the car pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into pinpricks of light before vanishing completely. She didn't look back. He stood there until the sky began to bleed from black to gray. He felt nothing and everything all at once. It wasn't a phase. It was an ending. He froze, not from the cold seeping through the window pane, but from the vast, terrifying emptiness that had just opened up in front of him. His life, as he knew it, had just driven off into the darkness. And in that moment of absolute breaking, a new life, a harder and more beautiful life, was about to begin. He didn't know it then, but the sound of that car door closing was not just an ending. It was the first, brutal note of a symphony he was not yet ready to hear. 5 years later, the ghost of 3 a.m. had faded, replaced by the gentler alarm of a 5:30 sunrise. Kieran moved through the quiet of his apartment with a practiced economy of motion. The world was still dark, but here, in this small 2-bedroom space filled with the scent of coffee and cinnamon, his world was already bright. He was a tall, brown-skinned man in his early 30s, with a strength in his shoulders that came from lifting more than just boxes at work. He carried the weight of single fatherhood with a quiet dignity, a weariness in his eyes that was always tempered by a deep, unwavering well of patience. He measured out coffee grounds, the scrape of the scoop the first sound of the day. On the refrigerator, a gallery of crayon masterpieces was held up by mismatched magnets. A smiling sun, a lopsided house, and a dozen portraits of a tall black man with short, natural hair holding hands with a little black girl whose braids defied gravity. This was his universe now. This was his everything. "Daddy?" a small voice called from the hallway. Kieran smiled, the expression softening the tired lines around his eyes. "In the kitchen, sweet pea. Pancakes are coming." Amara appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. At 6 years old, she was a whirlwind of bright energy, her natural hair styled in beautiful braids with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved. She clutched a worn, one-eyed stuffed giraffe. Named Gigi, she was the spitting image of her mother, a fact that was both a blessing and a constant low-level ache in Kieran's chest. "Are they the swirly ones?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "The swirliest," he confirmed, pouring batter onto the hot griddle. He wasn't a master chef. His pancakes were often a little burnt on one side, their shapes more abstract art than perfect circles. But he made them with a love so fierce, it was a tangible ingredient. and Amara declared them the best in the entire world. Their morning routine was a well-choreographed dance. He'd pack her lunch while she chattered about a dream involving a talking squirrel and a trip to the moon. He'd braid a loose strand of her hair back into place, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. She'd tell him his worn work boots were boring and needed glitter. He'd tell her glitter wasn't part of the warehouse uniform. These were the moments that stitched his life together, the small, mundane acts of love that had filled the cavernous hole Naima's departure had left behind. He worked as a shift supervisor at a massive logistics depot on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was loud, demanding work, a world of timetables, scanners, and forklifts. He was good at it. He was reliable, fair, a quiet leader who earned respect not through authority, but through consistency. He treated everyone the same, from the new hires to the regional managers. He saw the person, not the position. It was a philosophy he lived by. After his shift, he would pick Amara up from her after-school program. His arrival always met with a squeal and a running hug that nearly knocked him over. Their evenings were simple: homework at the kitchen table, a walk to the park if the weather was good, stories before bed. He was both father and mother, the fixer of broken toys and the chaser of bad dreams. He never spoke of Naima. He had packed away her photos, her clothes, her memory, into a single box in the back of his closet. He did it not out of anger, but for survival. He couldn't afford to drown in the past when his daughter's future depended on him staying afloat in the present. His life was not large or glamorous, but it was full. It was full of the sound of beaded braids clicking, the smell of slightly burnt pancakes, and the unconditional, all-consuming love of a little girl who thought her dad was the strongest man in the world. And for Kieran, that was more than enough. Miles away, in a glass tower that scraped the clouds, Isla Sterling started her day not with the smell of coffee, but with the cold, blue glow of a tablet displaying market analytics from the Asian markets. Her penthouse apartment was a testament to minimalist perfection: white walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city below. There were no crayon drawings on her stainless steel refrigerator. There were no worn-out stuffed animals on her designer furniture. The only sound was the faint, sterile hum of the air filtration system. Isla was a woman who commanded space. In her late 30s, she was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate, a position she had clawed her way to with relentless intelligence and a work ethic that bordered on punishing. She was a beautiful black woman, her deep brown skin luminous even in the harsh light of her office, her natural hair always pulled back in an elegant, severe bun. She wore tailored suits that were more like armor, her posture impeccable, her expression a carefully curated mask of detached authority. She was a powerhouse, a name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear in boardrooms across the country. But the woman who sat alone in the vast, empty apartment was not the icon on the cover of business magazines. She was lonely. The silence of her home wasn't peaceful, it was deafening. She had a personal chef, but the food always tasted like nothing. She had a driver, but she had nowhere to go that wasn't a meeting or a gala. Her life was a series of transactions, of acquisitions and mergers, of calculated risks and strategic alliances. Love, in her world, was a liability. Her parents, both celebrated academics, had loved her achievements, not her. A failed engagement years ago had taught her that vulnerability was a weakness to be exploited. So she had built her walls high and thick, fortifying them with success until she was safe, powerful, and utterly, completely isolated. Her morning was a blur of video conferences and curt emails. She dismantled a rival's proposal with surgical precision, her voice calm and even as she laid out its flaws. She approved a multi-million-dollar budget without blinking. She was brilliant, and she was miserable. She ended her last call and stared out at the city lights twinkling below. They looked like scattered jewels, cold and distant. She had conquered this city, had bent it to her will, but she didn't belong to it. She was just an observer, watching life from behind a thick pane of soundproof glass. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the sharp pang of a question she usually kept buried. What was it all for? The question hung in the sterile air, unanswered. She had everything a person could want, and yet she felt like she had nothing at all. Her world was full of value, but it was devoid of worth. That evening, the sky wept. A cold, relentless rain lashed against the city, turning streets into slick, black mirrors. Isla's driver had called in sick, a rare and inconvenient disruption to her perfectly scheduled life. She'd driven herself to a late-night negotiation on the other side of town, a final, brutal meeting to close a hostile takeover. She had won, of course. She always won. But the victory felt hollow, leaving the familiar metallic taste of exhaustion in her mouth. Driving home on the unfamiliar, poorly lit streets of a neighborhood far from her own, it happened. A jarring thump, a violent shudder, and the wheel wrenched in her hands. The tire pressure warning light screamed red on the dashboard. She pulled the luxury sedan over, its sleek, expensive frame looking alien and out of place against the backdrop of brick row houses and shuttered storefronts. The rain was coming down in sheets now, drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof of the car. She looked at her phone. 1% battery. It died before she could even open her contacts app. She was stranded. Isla Sterling, the woman who controlled a global empire, was utterly helpless. For a moment, panic, a raw and unfamiliar emotion, seized her. She was a powerful black woman in a designer suit, alone on a dark street in a neighborhood the news would describe as troubled. She locked the doors, her heart hammering against her ribs. The world outside the car was a blur of rain and shadow. Headlights would occasionally sweep past, illuminating the deluge for a brief second, before plunging her back into darkness. It was in the glare of one such pair of headlights that she saw him. A man getting out of an old, dependable-looking pickup truck. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple work jacket. He paused, looking at her disabled vehicle, his expression unreadable from a distance. Fear coiled in her stomach. This was it. This was the kind of random, senseless danger her carefully constructed life was supposed to protect her from. But he didn't approach her window. He just stood by his truck for a moment, as if debating. Then, with a sense of weary resolution, he walked towards her car. He didn't rap on the glass or try the handle. He just stood a respectful distance from her door, the rain plastering his short, natural hair to his head, and waited. After a long moment, she cautiously lowered the window a few inches. "You have a flat," he said, his voice calm and low, barely audible over the storm. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact. "I'm aware," she replied, her own voice tighter and colder than she intended. He didn't seem offended. He just nodded. "It's a bad night to be stuck. You need a hand?" She studied him. There was no menace in his eyes, only a quiet concern. He looked tired, like a man who had just finished a long day and wanted nothing more than to be home. He was just a person seeing another person in trouble. This simple, human decency was so foreign in her world of transactional relationships that it disarmed her. "My phone is dead," she admitted, the words feeling like a surrender. "I can't call for a tow." "Got a spare?" "In the trunk. I have no idea how to change it." The admission was humiliating. She could dissect a corporate balance sheet in seconds, but she was useless when faced with a lug wrench. He nodded again, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That's okay, I do." He gestured with his head back towards his truck. "Pop the trunk. You should stay in the car where it's dry." She hesitated for only a second before pressing the button. She watched in her rearview mirror as this stranger, this black man with kind eyes and worn work boots, went to work in the pouring rain. He moved with a steady, unhurried competence, the beam of his phone's flashlight cutting through the gloom. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for anything. He just changed the tire. In a world where every action had a motive, where every favor came with an invoice, this quiet, unconditional act of service was a thing of shocking power. It was a language she had long forgotten how to speak. When he was finished, his jacket soaked through, he knocked gently on her window. "All set," he said, his voice still calm. "It's a donut, so you'll need to drive slow and get it replaced tomorrow. But it'll get you home." She fumbled in her purse, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you. Please let me pay you for your time." She pulled out all the cash she had, a few $100 bills. He looked at the money in her hand and then back at her face. He slowly shook his head. "No, ma'am, you don't have to do that. Just be safe." And with that, he turned and walked back to his truck, leaving her sitting in her silent, impossibly expensive car, holding a handful of useless money. She watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing into the rain. For the first time in over a decade, Isla Sterling felt a crack in her armor. And through that crack, something dangerously close to a tear began to form. She wasn't just grateful, she was profoundly, inexplicably moved. The next day the city was washed clean. Sunlight glinted off damp pavement, and the air felt fresh and new. Isla, however, felt as though the storm was still raging inside her. The stranger's quiet kindness had unsettled her more than any hostile negotiation ever had. It had exposed a deep and aching void within her own life. She found the name of the garage near where she had broken down and had her assistant arrange for the tire replacement. But she couldn't shake the man's face from her mind. It felt wrong, incomplete, to let his gesture go unacknowledged. It was more than just a changed tire. He had, in a small but significant way, rescued her. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, she told her driver to take her to the garage herself. She needed to thank him properly. She had her assistant track down his license plate from a nearby traffic camera. A morally ambiguous use of her power, but one she justified with the purity of her intent. She learned his name was Kieran, and he lived just a few blocks from where she'd been stranded. She found herself standing on a quiet residential street, holding a ridiculously expensive gift basket filled with artisanal coffees and imported cheeses, feeling more out of place than she ever had in a Tokyo boardroom. She knocked on the door of his apartment, her heart beating a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The door opened, and there he was. In the daylight, he looked younger, his features softer. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, and his surprise at seeing her was evident. "Ma'am," he said, his eyebrows rising, "is everything all right with the tire?" "The tire is fine," Isla said, her voice more formal than she'd like. "I'm Isla. I wanted to thank you again, properly." She thrust the gift basket towards him. He looked at the basket, then back at her. A flicker of something, amusement, confusion, in his eyes. Before he could respond, a small voice piped up from behind his legs. "Daddy, who's the fancy lady?" Isla looked down and saw a little girl with bright, curious eyes and beaded braids peeking out. It was the girl from the crayon drawings in his truck, Amara. She was even more vibrant in person, a small sunbeam of a child. Kieran placed a gentle hand on his daughter's head. Amara, this is Isla. She had some car trouble last night. Isla, this is my daughter, Amara. Hi, Amara said, stepping forward with the uninhibited confidence of a 6-year-old. She looked Isla up and down, taking in the tailored pantsuit and expensive shoes. Why do you look so sad? The question was so direct, so unfiltered, it was like a physical blow. No one had asked Isla a question like that in years. In her world, emotions were weaknesses to be hidden, not observations to be shared. She opened her mouth to offer a polite corporate denial, but no words came out. Kieran, seeing her discomfort, gently intervened. That's not a polite question, sweet pea. But her eyes are crinkly, Amara insisted, with the irrefutable logic of a child. Like when I miss Mama. The name hung in the air, thick with unspoken history. Kieran's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He cleared his throat. We were just about to have dinner, he said, changing the subject, his voice a little strained. Imperfect pancakes, it's a Tuesday tradition. You should stay, Amara declared. Daddy's pancakes are the best, even when they're black on the bottom. An invitation to dinner in a small apartment for burnt pancakes. It was the most absurd, most terrifying, most wonderful offer Isla had received in her entire adult life. Every instinct screamed at her to make a polite excuse, to retreat to the safety of her sterile penthouse. But then she looked at Kieran's tired, kind eyes and at Amara's hopeful, expectant face, and she heard herself say a word she hadn't realized she was going to say. Okay. The inside of their apartment was small, but it radiated a warmth that her sprawling penthouse completely lacked. It smelled of cinnamon and home. Every surface seemed to have a story. A stack of children's books on the coffee table, a lopsided clay pot holding a thriving plant on the windowsill, and crayon drawings everywhere. Isla sat awkwardly on the sofa, the cellophane on the gift basket crinkling loudly in the comfortable silence. Kieran moved around the kitchen with a familiar grace, Amara acting as his very chatty sous chef. Isla watched them, fascinated. She watched as he let Amara stir the batter, even though she was sloshing it over the sides of the bowl. She watched as he patiently answered a never-ending stream of questions about why the sky was blue and whether giraffes could swim. There was an ease between them, a deep and unspoken bond that was evident in every shared glance, in every gentle touch. It was a kind of wealth Isla had never known. He served the pancakes on colorful plastic plates. They were, as advertised, slightly burnt. But as Isla took a bite, a strange thing happened. The simple taste of the pancake, made with no fancy ingredients but with an abundance of love, was the most delicious thing she had eaten in years. It tasted real. She ate 2 and then a third, listening as Amara recounted the entire plot of a cartoon she had watched that afternoon. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Isla laughed. Not a polite corporate chuckle, but a real, genuine laugh that came from deep in her belly. Kieran looked over at her, and in that moment, she didn't feel like a CEO. She felt like a person. Later, as Kieran was tucking Amara into bed, the little girl came running back out into the living room. She was holding a piece of paper, a fresh drawing. She held it out to Isla. It was a picture of 3 stick figures under a bright yellow sun. A tall man with scribbled black hair, a small girl with lines and dots for beaded braids, and a woman in a blue dress with an elegant bun drawn on top of her head. They were all holding hands. This is for you, Amara said, her voice serious. It's my family. That's Daddy. That's me. She pointed to the last figure. And that's you? Isla took the drawing, her fingers trembling. The crayon felt warm in her hand. She looked at the simple, smiling figures, at this innocent, profound offering of inclusion. A little girl she had met only hours ago had drawn her into her family. The sheer, uncalculated generosity of it broke through the last of her defenses. The walls she had spent a lifetime building came crumbling down. A single, hot tear escaped and slid down her cheek, landing on the crayon sun. Amara's face fell. "Why are you crying like me when I miss Mama?" she whispered, her voice full of concern. Kieran came and knelt beside his daughter, his expression a mixture of tenderness and deep, complicated sorrow. He didn't have an answer. Isla didn't either. She just clutched the drawing to her chest, a piece of paper that had suddenly become the most valuable thing she owned. Days turned into a week, then two. A strange and delicate routine began to form. Isla found reasons to be in Kieran's neighborhood. A meeting that ran late, a file she'd forgotten at a nearby coffee shop. They were flimsy excuses, and they both knew it. But neither of them called it out. They would spend evenings on his small apartment porch, the air growing cooler as summer faded towards fall. Amara would be asleep inside, and in the quiet darkness, they would talk. He spoke of Naima, not with the sharp edges of anger, but with the dull, persistent ache of a wound that never fully healed. "She just disappeared," he said one night, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distant city lights that belonged to Isla's world. "One day she was here, and the next, she wasn't. She was looking for something I couldn't give her. Something bigger, shinier than this life." He never said he hated her. He just missed the woman he thought he had married. In turn, Isla spoke of a different kind of emptiness. She told him about her parents, who only called to discuss her company's stock price. She spoke of the crushing pressure to be perfect, to be invincible, a pressure that had slowly suffocated the person she might have been. "I have hundreds of contacts in my phone," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "But I don't have a single person I could call if my car broke down again, except you." He didn't offer solutions or platitudes, he just listened. He saw her, not the CEO, not the powerhouse, but the lonely woman hiding behind a fortress of success. And in his quiet, steady presence, she felt safe enough to be vulnerable for the first time in her life. He showed his affection not with words, but with actions. He'd have a cup of hot ginger tea waiting for her when she arrived, remembering she'd mentioned liking it once. He fixed the loose clasp on her expensive watch with a pair of pliers from his toolbox, small, simple acts of service that felt more intimate and meaningful than any grand romantic gesture she had ever received. The bond between them grew slowly, cautiously, like a vine seeking sunlight. But with Amara, it was a wildflower blooming in fast motion. The little girl had adopted Isla completely. She would run to greet her with a fierce hug, saving her best drawings to present as gifts. She would insist Isla read her bedtime stories, her small body curled up against Isla's side. One evening, as Isla was reading a story about a lost star finding its constellation, Amara looked up at her, her eyes wide and serious. "Does this mean you're staying forever?" she asked. The question hung in the cozy room, as potent and direct as her first one had been. Isla's throat went tight. Forever was a word her life didn't have room for. It was a concept as foreign as burnt pancakes had been. She looked over at Kieran, who was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He had heard. She didn't know how to answer, so she just hugged the little girl tighter and whispered, "It's a very nice story, isn't it?" It was a deflection, a non-answer, and the quiet sadness in Kieran's eyes told her he knew it. The fragile, beautiful world they had started to build suddenly felt impossibly precarious. The world outside Kieran's small, warm apartment was cold and cruel, and it did not like things it couldn't understand. A photographer, hungry for a scoop, caught a picture. It wasn't scandalous, just a photo of Isla Sterling, the billionaire CEO, sitting on the steps of a modest apartment building, laughing as a little black girl with beaded braids showed her a dandelion. But in the high-stakes world of corporate power, context was irrelevant. Perception was everything. The photo landed on the desk of Marcus Thorne, a rival on Isla's board. Marcus was a man who thrived on weakness, who saw connection as a vulnerability to be exploited. He was ambitious, insecure, and deeply resentful of Isla's effortless command. He saw the photo not as a picture of a woman finding happiness, but as a weapon. He called an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere in the sterile, mahogany-paneled room was tense. Marcus projected the photo onto the massive screen at the head of the table. Isla, sitting in her customary chair, felt a cold dread wash over her. "This picture was taken yesterday," Marcus began, his voice dripping with false concern. "It seems our CEO has been spending a considerable amount of time in a less than reputable part of the city, with a man of no consequence, a warehouse worker, I believe." He let the words hang in the air, thick with condescension. "My personal life is not the board's concern," Isla stated, her voice dangerously calm. "It becomes our concern when it affects the company's image," Marcus countered smoothly. "We are in the middle of a delicate merger. We need our leader to project an image of stability, of unwavering focus. This dalliance makes you look erratic, unpredictable. It makes you look weak." The other board members, a collection of gray-faced men and women who valued stock prices over everything, shifted uncomfortably. They smelled blood in the water. "I am not weak," Isla said, her gaze locking onto Marcus. "Aren't you?" he sneered, sensing his advantage. "I have other photos, Isla. Photos that could be misinterpreted. A narrative could be spun. A powerful, lonely executive preying on a simple, working-class man. Or perhaps she's being blackmailed. Either way, it's a story that could do irreparable damage to our brand and to your reputation. So I suggest you end this. Cut off this distraction. Reassure the board where your loyalties lie." He was giving her an ultimatum. Her career, the empire she had built from nothing, or the quiet man and his daughter who had somehow become her home. She looked around the table, at the cold, calculating eyes of people who called her a colleague, but would throw her to the wolves without a second thought. She saw her entire life, a life of relentless ambition and profound loneliness, laid out before her. She had fought for this seat at this table, had sacrificed everything for it. And now she realized, with a sudden, shocking clarity, that she didn't want it anymore. The table was a prison, and she was finally ready to be free. She stood up. The room went silent. Everyone expected a fight, a denial, a strategic retreat. They expected the Isla Sterling they knew, the ruthless tactician, the Ice Queen. They were about to meet someone new. She walked to the head of the table, her steps deliberate and sure. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at the faces of the people who believed they held her future in their hands. "Marcus is right about one thing," she began, her voice quiet, but carrying an undeniable weight that commanded the room's full attention. "My focus has shifted." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a piece of paper. It was creased and slightly smudged, a stark contrast to the glossy reports on the table. She held it up for everyone to see. It was Amara's drawing of the 3 stick figures holding hands. "For 20 years I have dedicated my life to this company. I have measured my worth in quarterly earnings and market share. I have acquired assets. I have built platforms. I have generated billions of dollars in shareholder value." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "And then, a few weeks ago, I acquired this." She placed the drawing gently on the polished table. "This is a drawing from a 6-year-old girl. It is, by any financial metric, worthless. It's crayon on cheap paper. But it is the single most valuable thing I have ever owned, because it's not an asset, it's a gift. It represents a world where value isn't calculated, it's felt, where worth is measured in kindness, not in capital. She looked directly at Marcus, her eyes clear and free of fear. You speak of weakness. Let me tell you what real weakness is. It's being so afraid of losing power that you cannot recognize love. It's living in a world so small that you believe a man's worth is determined by his job title. That is a poverty of the soul that no amount of money can cure. She took a deep breath, the air in the room thick with a silence that was no longer just tense, but awestruck. I am not being blackmailed. I am not having a dalliance. I am, for the first time in my life, building something real. Something that doesn't have a stock ticker. I am building a family. She straightened up, her posture regal, her voice ringing with a newfound certainty. Therefore, I am tendering my resignation as CEO, effective immediately. I wish you all the best in your continued pursuit of things that can be bought and sold. She turned, and without another word, she walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a stunned silence and a child's drawing of a family sitting in the center of the cold, mahogany table. She didn't look back. She had a home to get to. Kieran saw the news alert on his phone while he was helping Amara with her homework. CEO Isla Sterling abruptly resigns. His heart sank. He knew with a sickening certainty that it was his fault. Their worlds had collided and hers had shattered. He felt a wave of guilt so profound it was nauseating. He had brought this chaos into her life, had exposed her to a cruelty she didn't deserve. He was sitting on the porch, staring into the twilight and trying to figure out how he would explain this to his daughter when her car pulled up. Not a chauffeured town car, but the one he had fixed the tire on. She got out, wearing the same power suit she must have worn to the meeting, but she looked different, lighter. She walked up the steps and stood before him, her expression soft and uncertain. He stood up, the words tumbling out of him in a pained rush. Isla, I saw the news. I am so sorry. I never wanted this for you. I never meant to cause you any trouble. She just looked at him, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her smile without a trace of sadness or reservation. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. You didn't cause me trouble, Kieran, she said, her voice gentle. You caused me to be saved. He stared at her, confused. Saved? You lost your company. I didn't lose anything that mattered, she whispered, stepping closer. She reached out and took his calloused hand in hers, her touch sending a jolt of warmth through him. For my whole life I've been living in a beautiful, empty house, and then I met you and Amara, and I realized I wasn't just visiting. I was finally coming home. He didn't know what to say. The world had just been turned upside down. The powerful CEO was gone, and in her place was just Isla, a woman with luminous dark brown skin and eyes that held the whole world in them. A woman who was choosing this, choosing him. But your life? He started, his voice rough with emotion. My life, she interrupted softly, is right here, if you'll have me. He looked into her eyes and saw his own future reflected there, a future he had never dared to dream of, a future filled with light and laughter and imperfect pancakes. He intertwined his fingers with hers, a simple gesture that felt like a solemn vow. He didn't need to say anything. She already knew the answer. In the quiet of the evening, with the sound of crickets beginning their nightly song, they just stood together, holding hands on the porch of the little apartment that had become the center of the universe. 3 months later, the world was a riot of autumn color. The crisp air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Isla hadn't just found a home, she had started to build one. She'd used her severance and her formidable skills to launch a foundation that funded community-led projects in underserved neighborhoods. Her first project was a sprawling community garden in the heart of Kieran's neighborhood, transforming a neglected vacant lot into a vibrant oasis of green. On a bright Saturday afternoon, the garden was bustling with life. Families were tending to their plots, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Kieran was on his knees, his dark hands covered in rich soil, showing a group of kids how to plant garlic bulbs. He looked up and saw Isla across the garden, her hair pulled back simply, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She was laughing with an older woman, one of the community elders, her posture relaxed and open. She had traded her power suits for jeans and a warm sweater. She had never looked more beautiful, more powerful. Their eyes met across the rows of kale and collard greens, and they shared a smile. It was a smile of deep, quiet contentment. This was their life now, a life built not on spreadsheets and stock prices, but on shared work, shared meals, and shared joy. Just then, Amara came running towards them, her beaded braids bouncing. She was clutching something tightly in her fist. She skidded to a stop in front of Isla, her face alight with purpose. "I made this for you," she said, her voice breathless with excitement. She opened her hand. On her palm lay a small, slightly lopsided bracelet made of colorful plastic beads, strung on a piece of elastic string. It was clumsy and imperfect, and the most beautiful piece of jewelry Isla had ever seen. Isla knelt down so she was at eye level with the little girl. "Oh, sweetie, it's wonderful. Thank you." Amara held the bracelet out, her expression serious and hopeful. "It's a forever bracelet," she explained. She then looked up at Isla, her bright eyes searching her face. "Does that mean you're staying forever?" It was the question again, the one she had deflected before. But this time, it wasn't scary. This time, it was a promise. Tears welled in Isla's eyes. But these were not tears of sadness or loss. They were tears of overwhelming, heart-stopping joy. She looked from Amara's earnest face to Kieran, who was now standing beside them, his own eyes shining, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Her two worlds, her past and her future, had merged into this one perfect, sun-drenched moment. She let Amara slide the bracelet onto her wrist, right next to her expensive, now meaningless watch. It fit perfectly. She looked back at the little girl who had saved her with a crayon drawing. "Yes," Isla whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so profound it felt sacred, forever. And so, in a garden built on forgotten ground, a family bloomed. It wasn't a family born of blood or obligation, but one built by choice, brick by brick, with acts of quiet courage and unconditional kindness. They learned that the greatest strength is not in building walls to keep the world out, but in having the courage to tear them down. They discovered that true wealth has nothing to do with what you own, and everything to do with who sees you, truly sees you, and chooses to stay. For love, in its purest form, is not something you find or earn. It is something you build together in the rich, fertile soil of an ordinary, extraordinary life.